The snowstorm had rolled in faster than anyone expected. Thick flakes drifted from the dark evening sky, covering the lonely roadside diner in a heavy white blanket. Wind howled past the windows and shook the metal sign above the door. But inside the small diner, the lights glowed warm and steady. It was the only place still open on this deserted stretch of highway. And on nights like this, it was more than a diner, it was a lifeline. Outside the entrance, the owner, an older woman with gray curls dusted in snow, stood waiting. Her coat was worn from years of work, and snowflakes clung to its shoulders as she wiped her hands together for warmth. Her name was Martha, and even though business had been slow for months, she refused to close her doors on a night when people might need help. In front of her stood a group of truckers who had been caught in the storm. Their massive rigs were lined up behind them, headlights glowing through the snow like distant stars. Steam rose from their exhaust pipes as engines idled, forming long white trails that drifted upward into the frozen air. The truckers moved aside as a man stepped forward, a tall, weathered driver wearing a navy blue cap and a thick denim jacket with a shearling collar. His beard was frosted from the cold, and his breath came out in heavy white puffs. The man stopped only a few feet from Martha. Behind him, dozens of truckers formed a silent line, waiting, watching, bracing against the cold, their boots pressed into the snow in perfect rows. Some crossed their arms for warmth. Others simply stared at the woman who had unexpectedly become the center of their attention. Martha gave the man a kind smile, though her face carried the exhaustion of someone who had been working long past closing time. She had already helped several stranded drivers earlier that evening, offering warm soup, hot coffee, and a place to wait out the storm. But now, seeing the sheer number of people outside, she realized the situation was much bigger than she had first thought. The man with the cap lowered his head respectfully before speaking. Snow gathered on the brim of his hat and along the shoulders of his jacket. Behind him, the line of truckers stretched out toward the parked rigs, their headlights reflecting off the falling snow. The moment felt strangely still, despite the storm raging around them. No one knew exactly what was going to happen next. But one thing was clear. This simple act of opening her door on a dangerous night had already set something in motion, something far bigger than Martha could have imagined. What she saw in front of her was not just a group of stranded drivers. It was a moment that would change everything in the days to come. The snowstorm was getting worse by the minute. As Martha stood at the entrance of her diner, she could see how quickly the conditions outside continued to deteriorate. The wind pushed hard against the parked trucks, rocking them slightly as heavy flakes blurred the headlights. Drivers who had been waiting inside their rigs finally realized they could not sit there any longer. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and the temperature was falling even faster. Just a few hours earlier, the highway had still been moving slowly, but now, the storm had shut everything down. Truckers who were trying to make their final deliveries before the holiday weekend were forced to pull over, forming a long, uneven line of rigs stretching down the road. Many had planned to push through the night, but the storm's strength made the decision for them. No one could keep driving in conditions like this. Several of the drivers stepped out of their trucks and hurried through the snow toward the diner. Their jackets were coated in white within seconds, and the wind made it hard to keep their eyes open. Some shielded their faces with their hands, others leaned their bodies forward just to keep moving. Each step showed how dangerous the weather had become. The man in the navy blue cap, who had spoken to Martha earlier, turned back to check on the group behind him. He signaled for the other drivers to keep moving toward the diner's warm lights. More truckers joined the line as additional rigs pulled in from the highway, their engines rumbling just long enough for the drivers to climb out safely. Martha watched all of this unfold with a growing sense of urgency. She knew these men hadn't come to her diner because they wanted a meal. They came because they didn't have another choice. The nearest shelter was miles away, and every minute spent outside increased the risk of frostbite or worse. She opened the diner door wider, letting the warm air spill out into the storm. "Come in quickly," she called out. "It's not safe out there anymore." The truckers didn't need to be told twice. One by one, they pushed through the icy wind and stepped inside, grateful for even a few moments of warmth. Behind them, the storm continued to build, swallowing the highway in white. And although Martha had no idea what the night would bring, She knew one thing for certain: the storm had only just begun. And her diner was now the only haven these drivers had. Inside the diner, the heat from the kitchen made the windows fog slightly, creating a sharp contrast to the freezing storm outside. The place was old, wooden walls worn smooth by years of customers, metal stools with cracked vinyl cushions, and a counter that had probably seen thousands of meals served before this night. But despite its age, the diner carried a warm, familiar feeling that made people relax the second they stepped in. Martha closed the door behind the last group of truckers, shutting out the harsh wind. The snow clung to her coat as she brushed it off and moved toward the counter. She looked around at the crowded space. Nearly every booth was taken, and several drivers stood near the coffee station, rubbing their hands together for warmth. Their faces showed exhaustion from hours of driving in impossible conditions. She walked toward the front window and wiped away the fog with her sleeve. Outside, more headlights cut through the snow, signaling additional trucks pulling off the road. The storm was pulling in anyone still trying to move along the highway, leaving them stranded with no shelter except her small diner. Martha sighed quietly. Business had been slow for months, and she had been struggling to cover the bills. The shelves in her pantry were not full, and the refrigerator held only enough ingredients for a normal night's service. But this wasn't a normal night. This was a night when people needed help, and she knew she couldn't turn them away. She turned toward the group and raised her voice just enough to carry through the diner. "Everyone, make yourselves comfortable. There's hot coffee for anyone who needs it," she said, motioning toward the counter. The man in the navy blue cap nodded at her gesture and stepped aside to let two younger drivers get closer to the warm drinks. The truckers exchanged looks, surprised, grateful, and maybe a little concerned about overwhelming her small business. Martha walked behind the counter and pulled out a large pot. Setting it on the stove, she reached for the remaining vegetables, canned goods, and spices she had left. It wasn't much, but she could stretch it into soup if she worked quickly. As she chopped ingredients, she glanced again at the window. Snow continued piling up, and the trucks outside were nearly buried to their headlights. This storm wasn't slowing down, and if it continued, these drivers might be stuck here for hours, maybe overnight. With that thought, Martha made her decision. She would serve them all, no matter how little she had. Helping them was the only thing that felt right. And with that, the long night inside the diner truly began. The diner grew warmer as more drivers settled inside, shaking the snow from their jackets and stamping their boots on the floor to remove the ice. The small space quickly filled with the sound of tired voices, clinking cups, and the low hum of people trying to thaw out after hours on the road. Even though the room was crowded, the atmosphere felt calmer than the chaos outside. The storm raged on, but here inside Martha's diner, there was a sense of temporary safety. Martha moved behind the counter, checking the large pot of soup she had started earlier. Steam rose steadily from the pot, carrying the smell of vegetables and spices across the room. It wasn't a fancy meal, but on a night like this, it felt like exactly what everyone needed. She ladled the soup into bowls, one after another, her hands moving quickly despite the exhaustion beginning to settle in. The man in the navy blue cap stepped closer to the counter, helping steady a tray so Martha could place several bowls onto it. "You're doing a lot for us," he said quietly, keeping his voice low so the others wouldn't overhear. Most people wouldn't open their door in a storm like this. Martha offered him a small smile. Most people don't have a diner full of cold truckers staring at them. She replied lightly, though her tone carried genuine warmth. "Go ahead and pass these around." With a nod, he lifted the tray and made his way through the diner, handing out bowls to the men gathered at the tables and standing along the walls. Each driver accepted the hot soup with a grateful nod or murmured, "Thank you," warming their hands around the bowls before taking the first comforting spoonful. Despite the crowd, everyone tried to make room for one another. Drivers scooted closer in booths or stood shoulder to shoulder along the counter. A few of them even offered to help carry drinks or refill water pitchers, wanting to take some of the burden off Martha. She appreciated their gestures, but she also knew she needed to keep things moving if she wanted to feed everyone before the supplies ran out. As she returned to the stove to refill the pot with the last ingredients she had left, Martha glanced around the diner. The sight of the truckers, exhausted, soaking wet, but slowly regaining their strength, gave her a quiet sense of purpose. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and she had no idea how long they would be stuck here. But at least for now, they were safe, warm, and fed. Outside the windows, the snow piled higher against the trucks. Inside, the warmth continued to spread, bowl by bowl. As the storm pressed harder against the diner's walls, the noise inside gradually softened. The truckers, warmed by the soup and the steady heat from the kitchen, finally began to relax. Some leaned back in their booths, their shoulders no longer tense. Others stood quietly near the windows, watching the wind push snow across the glass in thick waves. Martha carried another pot of hot coffee to the counter when she noticed the man in the navy blue cap sitting alone at a small table near the window. His soup bowl was empty, but he hadn't moved for several minutes. Instead, he stared outside at the buried trucks, his hands clasped around a cup of coffee that had long since stopped steaming. She approached him with a gentle expression. "Is everything all right? You haven't touched your refill," she said. He looked up, his expression softening as he met her eyes. "Just thinking," he replied. "This storm wasn't in the forecast. I was supposed to be home by tomorrow morning." Martha pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, if only for a moment. It was the first time she had rested since the truckers arrived. "You have family waiting?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, adjusting the brim of his cap. "My wife and 2 kids. They think I'm on the road for just one more short run. I promised I'd be home before the weekend. But with weather like this..." He paused, exhaling a long breath. "I don't want them worrying." Martha nodded. She understood that feeling more than he knew. The holidays always brought out the longing for family, especially for those who worked far from home. "They'll understand," she said softly. "You're doing everything you can. No one can fight a storm." The man offered a small, tired smile. "Maybe so, but nights like these remind you how far away you are." Around them, the other truckers had begun chatting quietly, sharing stories of long routes, tough winters, and near misses on the highway. The man glanced at them before returning his gaze to Martha. "I want you to know," he said, "what you're doing for us, it means more than you think. Most places would have locked up hours ago, but you opened your door and gave us a chance to rest. We won't forget that." Martha felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the diner's heaters. "I'm just doing what anyone should do," she said. "You're all out there working hard so people like me can live our lives. If I can help even a little, that's enough." The man nodded again, this time with deeper gratitude. Outside, the wind howled through the storm. Inside, for the first time since the night began, there was a sense of calm, a quiet understanding shared between a weary driver and the woman who had given him shelter. As the hours passed, the diner settled into a steady, exhausted rhythm. Conversations faded into low murmurs, and several truckers rested their heads on folded arms at their tables, trying to recover from the long, stressful drive. The storm outside continued without slowing, rattling the windows and piling snow higher against the trucks parked along the roadside. Inside, the warmth held strong, but the night was far from over. Martha stepped away from the front room and moved toward the kitchen. It was the first moment she had to check on her supplies since the truckers had arrived. When she opened the pantry door, the dim light revealed nearly empty shelves. Only a few cans remained, half a bag of rice, and a small crate of vegetables that had seen better days. The refrigerator wasn't much fuller. A couple of cartons of eggs, a bit of milk, and a few leftover pieces of meat from earlier in the week. She rested her hands on the edge of the counter, letting the reality sink in. It wasn't that she didn't expect this. Business had been slow for months, and she had stopped ordering large quantities of ingredients to avoid waste. But the sudden arrival of so many stranded drivers meant the food she had intended to stretch over several days was nearly gone in just a few hours. Behind her, one of the younger cashiers, Emily, peeked in. "Martha, we barely have anything left," she said quietly. "Should we start turning people away? Maybe tell them the kitchen's closed?" Martha shook her head slowly. "No, not tonight." She reached for the remaining vegetables and set them on the cutting board. "They're out there working every day to keep goods moving across the country. The least we can do is make sure they're fed while they're stuck here." Emily hesitated. "But if the storm keeps going, we might not have anything for tomorrow." "We'll manage tomorrow when it comes," Martha replied, her voice steady even though she felt a knot forming in her stomach. "Right now, these men need a hot meal more than I need a full pantry." She moved with renewed purpose, chopping vegetables and tossing them into a large pot. The knife tapped rhythmically against the cutting board, echoing her determination. She added rice to stretch the broth, then poured in the remaining milk to make it richer. It wasn't a perfect recipe, but it would be warm and filling. From the dining room, she could hear the truckers shifting in their seats, the low hum of conversation, and the sound of boots scraping against the floor. They had no idea the diner was down to its final ingredients. They only knew that Martha had welcomed them in without hesitation. As the pot began to boil, she stirred it slowly, watching the mixture thicken. She hoped it would be enough. This night was testing her limits, but she wasn't backing down. By the time the new pot of soup began to simmer, the storm outside had reached its full strength. The wind roared like a freight train passing just inches from the diner walls, and thick sheets of snow slammed against the windows with relentless force. The lights inside flickered once, causing several truckers to lift their heads in alarm before the power stabilized again. Martha wiped her hands on a towel and moved toward the front windows. She brushed aside the condensation to get a clearer view, but even then, she could barely see more than a few yards into the storm. The trucks parked outside were now buried up to their headlights. Snow continued to pile around the tires, forming deep drifts that made the vehicles look as though they'd been sitting there for days rather than hours. A few of the drivers noticed the worsening conditions and stood up from their seats. The man in the navy blue cap tightened his jacket zipper as he headed toward the door. "We should clear some of the snow before our rigs get stuck for good," he said to the others. Several truckers nodded and followed him outside despite Martha's concerned look. As soon as the door opened, a blast of icy wind pushed into the diner, scattering napkins across the nearest tables. The men lowered their heads and trudged into the storm with shovels they carried in their trucks. Their silhouettes quickly disappeared into the swirling white. From inside, Martha watched them work. Although the visibility was low, she could make out their movements, leaning into the wind, digging around the wheels, brushing snow off the headlights. It was clear they weren't doing it just for themselves. They were working as a group, making sure every truck had a chance to move again once the storm finally eased. Emily stood beside Martha, clutching her arms for warmth. "Should we tell them to come back inside? It looks dangerous out there." Martha shook her head gently. "They know what they're doing, and they're not the type to sit still while others struggle. Let them help one another." She knew truckers lived a life most people didn't understand: long hours, dangerous weather, and constant pressure to make deliveries on time. But they also had something rare: solidarity. Watching them out there in the freezing winds reminded her how strong that bond was. After nearly 20 minutes, the men came back inside, brushing snow from their jackets and stomping their boots on the mat. Their faces were red from the cold, but their spirits were noticeably lifted. They had done what they could, and even small progress felt like a victory against a storm this severe. Martha greeted them with bowls of fresh soup, the steam rising as they wrapped their hands around the warm dishes. Outside, the blizzard continued to roar. Inside, the fight to stay safe and stay hopeful pressed on. By early morning, the storm had finally begun to lose its strength. The wind softened to a slow whistle, and the heavy wall of snow falling through the night turned into small drifting flakes. The storm was not fully gone, but its most punishing hours had passed. Inside the diner, a quiet calm settled over the room, replacing the tension and uncertainty of the night before. Martha emerged from the kitchen with a tired but genuine smile. She had barely slept, and her feet ached from standing for hours. But the sight before her gave her a sense of relief. Several truckers had dozed off at their tables, their jackets pulled up like blankets. Others sat in small groups, sipping the last of the coffee and watching the sky lighten through the frosted windows. Emily flipped the sign on the door from "open" to "closed." Not because Martha asked her to, but because it was clear the diner had nothing left to sell. The shelves were empty, the refrigerator held only scraps, and the soup pot from the night before had been scraped clean. The diner had used every last ingredient to keep the truckers fed through the worst of the storm. The man in the navy blue cap approached the counter. stretching his stiff shoulders. "Looks like the storm's finally letting up," he said, glancing outside. His truck, once buried under layers of snow, was now just visible as the skies slowly brightened. Martha nodded. "I'm glad you all made it through the night. I didn't know if we'd have enough food to keep everyone going." "You did more than enough," he replied. "Most places on the highway were shut tight. If you hadn't kept the lights on, we would have been stuck out there with nothing." A few of the other drivers lined up near the door, getting ready to head back to their trucks. They scraped frost from the windows with gloved hands and checked their engines. The storm had trapped them for the night, but now they had a chance to get moving again. Before leaving, several of them stopped to thank Martha personally. Some shook her hand. Others simply nodded with a genuine appreciation that words couldn't fully express. They knew what she had sacrificed, her remaining supplies, her sleep, and probably a full day's income, to make sure they stayed safe. Martha stood by the doorway, watching them walk through the snow toward their rigs. Their footprints trailed behind them as they climbed into their trucks, preparing to return to the road. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself as a soft breeze carried the last remnants of the storm across the parking lot. The diner was empty now, silent except for the faint hum of the heater. The shelves were bare, the kitchen drained, and Martha felt the weight of the coming days pressing on her shoulders. Still, as the trucks began to pull away one by one, she couldn't help but smile. They were safe. And that, to her, made the long, exhausting night worth it. Later that afternoon, long after the last truck pulled away from the diner, the storm clouds finally lifted. Martha stayed behind to clean the nearly empty kitchen, collecting the used bowls, wiping down the counters, and trying not to think too much about how she would restock anything with the money she didn't have. The night had been meaningful, but it had also drained the diner of everything it owned. Meanwhile, miles down the highway, the truckers who had taken shelter at Martha's diner stopped at a large fuel station and rest area, a place where drivers regularly exchanged route updates, weather warnings, and stories from the road. As they parked their rigs in long rows, several drivers gathered near the fueling area, still talking about the night before. The man in the navy blue cap, the one who had spoken with Martha the most, became the unofficial storyteller. A group of truckers who had been stuck in other parts of the storm circled around him. Curious about how he and his team made it through, he explained how the roads had become impossible to navigate, how the wind almost pushed some rigs off the highway, and how Martha's diner had become their only refuge. She opened her doors when everything else was closed. He told them, didn't ask for money, didn't turn anyone away. She used whatever she had left to feed all of us. And believe me, she didn't have much. One of the drivers let out a low whistle. Most business owners wouldn't do that. Not these days. Another nodded. Sounds like she kept you all alive last night. The man in the navy blue cap adjusted his gloves, his expression serious. She did, and we nearly cleaned out her entire kitchen. She didn't say a word about it, but that diner of hers is probably running on fumes now. A quiet pause fell over the group. Truckers knew hardship better than most. They understood what it meant to struggle through weeks when miles were low and paychecks were thin. And they understood the weight of someone giving more than they could afford. Someone like her shouldn't be left hanging after helping that many people. Another driver said. Exactly, the man in the navy blue cap replied. She didn't help us because she wanted something in return. She helped us because it was the right thing to do. But now it's our turn. The group nodded with growing determination. Within minutes, they pulled out their phones, calling fellow drivers they knew from different routes. Word spread across truck stops, break areas, and dispatch radios. Drivers shared the story of the small diner owner who had opened her doors in the middle of a deadly storm and asked for nothing in return. By nightfall, dozens of truckers had heard the story. By the next morning, it would be hundreds. And all of them agreed on one thing. Martha wasn't going to face her struggles alone anymore. 2 mornings later, Martha stood inside her diner staring at the nearly empty shelves, trying to plan out how she would keep the business running through the week. She had managed to buy a small amount of supplies using what little money she had left. But it was nowhere near enough to reopen properly. Still, she wiped down the counters, straightened the chairs, and told herself she would figure things out as she always had. Just as she walked toward the front window, She noticed a faint rumble, steady and low, like distant thunder. At first, she thought it was the wind returning. But the sky outside was clear. And the sound was growing louder. Not fading. Curious and slightly uneasy, she stepped closer to the window and pushed aside the curtain. Her breath caught in her throat. One truck, then another, then another. A long line of semi-trucks was turning off the highway into her gravel parking lot. Dozens at first, then more arriving behind them. Engines idled as drivers stepped out, one after another, filling the lot with movement and color. Within minutes, nearly 100 trucks stood parked in rows, shining under the morning sun. At the front of the group was the man in the navy blue cap. Martha opened the door slowly. Overwhelmed. What's all this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man approached with a warm smile, holding a large envelope in his gloved hand. "We told the others what you did for us," he said, "not just the storm, but how you gave everything you had without questioning whether you could afford it." Behind him, the crowd of truckers nodded in agreement. "We decided it was time someone helped you back," he continued. "You didn't ask for anything, so we brought what you didn't ask for." He handed her the envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a thick stack of bills. Donations gathered from drivers across multiple states. Some gave what they could. Others gave far more. As she flipped through the envelope, she realized it was more money than she'd seen in years, more than enough to restock the diner, repair equipment, and keep her doors open for a long time. Tears filled her eyes. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," the man replied. "You helped us without hesitation. Now it's our turn to keep this place alive." A wave of cheers rose from the crowd, warm and heartfelt. Martha stepped forward and hugged him, grateful beyond words. For the first time in months, the weight on her shoulders began to lift. Her diner wasn't just saved. It had become a symbol of kindness, and the kindness had come full circle.